there's a couple of people that'll be a little bit late, and then I know one or two of you have to leave early. Anyway, it's my great pleasure to introduce one of my classmates from UC Berkeley, although he was the model PhD student, so he was done way ahead of Professor O'Connor. Anyway, he received his PhD in 1988 from Berkeley. Did Mike O'Malley, and he's been at George Mason since 1994. Before then, he was at Vassar, no?
Yeah.
He's talking today from his forthcoming book by the University of Chicago Press, and he tells me that it will be out next year, much to his chagrin. He was hoping that it would be out this year. And that's called The Entwined History of Race and Money in America. He's also the author of a wonderful book about standardizing time in America called Keeping Watch, A History of America, American Time, 1990 and 1995 by Viking Penguin, and co-author more recently of a wonderful collection in honor of his former dissertation director, the late, really wonderful cultural historian of America, Larry Levine. And this book is called The Cultural Turn in U.S. History, Past, Present, and Future. He helped to establish the Center for History and New Media at George Mason University, and tomorrow he's going to be talking to History Club undergraduates, some other undergraduates, some graduate students about digitization and the way it's kind of revolutionized our work, particularly in his, and that is in Anglo-American, I would say. So certainly it's not that way for all of us.
Will be.
Mike's interests are as kind of creative and as intellectually lively as he is. Everything from the history of American jazz and music in general to sound recording to something I haven't yet asked him about, which is the history of the zip code.
Yes.
So today he's going to speak on compensated emancipation, why does it fail? So please help me in welcoming Mike O'Malley.
Very flattered to be here, very flattered, and also to be in the presence of two people who helped me so much when I was starting out. Maura, my classmate, and Wayne Durrell. We were fellows together at the Smithsonian back, I think it was the Eisenhower administration. It was a long time ago. And I would not be half the person I am if it hadn't been for the community of graduate students there, which meant a great deal. So I'm humble. Well, yeah, I'm pretty humble. There's a moment in slave narratives, in almost all American slave narratives, where the slave gets a chance to buy themselves into freedom. And it's in almost all the narratives. And sometimes the slaves reject it. Sometimes they say they don't want to do this because it endorses the principle of slavery. Sometimes they do it reluctantly. There's a moment in Olaudah Equiano's narrative where his master has promised him, I think if it's 40 pounds sterling, if he comes up with 40 pounds sterling, he can buy his freedom. So he does it. And the master is shocked. He's like, say what? He can't believe that he came up with the money, and then he came up with it so quickly. And he says, if I'd known you could earn it, I wouldn't have named that sum. And it raises the problem that's always present in those moments. If the slave can earn their purchase price, they are worth more than the price. And that's always going to be true. If you up the price and the slave earns it, then they're worth more than the price. They're in this kind of trap. And what that moment, I think, points out is the dual nature of a slave, the dual nature of a racial slave, anyway, in the United States, in the American context, the North American context. Slaves have a non-negotiable intrinsic character, which makes it possible to enslave them. That is blackness. They're black. That is imagined as a natural, non-negotiable property. And people imagine that despite the fact that, hey, that kid's awful light-skinned and he looks like you. They still imagine that blackness is a non-negotiable property. That non-negotiable property makes them saleable, makes them into commodities. But of course, slaves also have a commodity nature. They circulate as commodities. Their price goes up and down. That you can speculate in them. You can gain by their increased price. So they have a commodity nature, and they have this essentialized intrinsic value. So what I would argue is that they're imagined as gold is imagined in the economy. Gold bugs, people who want to return to the gold standard, imagine gold as having a fixed natural value. But it passes as a commodity, and it fluctuates in value. And that might appear to make no sense, and that's because it doesn't make any sense. The gold standard position, I think, doesn't make sense. Gold bugs will say, if you raise this point, they'll say, well, it's not the gold that's fluctuating. It's everything else. Gold is not going up in price or down in price. Dollars are getting cheaper. Gold is the magic thing that stays the same. Well, it's the same with slaves. Slaves, like gold, are the constant that enables other forms of negotiation. Their racial value forms a constant in the way that the imagined value of gold forms a constant. And I'm going to try to explore that fairly possibly preposterous concept through the question of emancipation. And what I'm going to argue is that if the United States had a central bank, like the Bank of England, it could have ended slavery the way England did, by buying out the slaves. The United States doesn't do that. Instead, it takes this bloody civil war. And the question is why? There are a lot of answers for that, and some of you already know. I'm just going to throw a new one in the pot. In 1821, Congressman Henry Meigs of New York introduced a bill to end slavery by, he said, devoting 500 million acres of the public lands west of the Mississippi. What he was going to do is he'd take this land, 500 million acres, and he'd give it to slaveholders to do it as they wish. They could sell it or they could farm it. They'd be given enough, an amount of land equal to their slaves. So they'd go to a local judge and they'd say, I have 20 slaves. And the judge would say, yeah, they're good slaves. They're worth X number of parcels of land. And they could either farm that land or they could sell it. And that way you'd get rid of slavery. You'd promote the settlement of the West. You'd promote the yeoman farmer, which of course everyone who doesn't live in the West professes to love. He also added, you could sell the other land next to those 500 million acres and use those proceeds to finance the colonization of slaves to Africa. So he loves this plan. You get rid of slavery painlessly, you get rid of those pesky black people, you settle the West. It looks like a no-brainer to him. It dies. The House votes to table it. It goes nowhere. There are multiple plans for compensated emancipation in American history, and they all fail. Lincoln tries one during the Civil War, and that works a little bit, but mostly they fail. They don't even get discussed. Elbridge Gerry, James Madison, Mr. Meigs, Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln all introduced plans for compensated emancipation, and they mostly fell dead to the floor. England, of course, as most of you know, abolished slavery in 1833 with the Slavery Abolition Act. Parliament subscribed a fund of £20 million to compensate slaveholders for lost property. The act freed slaves under 6 immediately. It reclassified other slaves as apprentices and provided that all apprentices would be freed by 1840. Their former masters would be paid cash as compensation, cash raised ultimately from British taxpayers. And that's pretty amazing. The British scheme required people with no direct connection to slavery to fund the cost of compensating persons on distant Caribbean islands. Meigs's plan, on the other hand, cost the American taxpayers nothing. Nothing at all. The only people who bear the cost are, of course, the Indians, but they're not in the calculation. That land will be given, that land the United States already claims, will be given to slaveholders in compensation for the end of slavery. It never got a serious hearing. So why is England able to abolish slavery with a stroke of the pen and a pass of the banknote, and the United States requires a bloody civil war? And again, there are a lot of answers for that, and I just want to offer this new one. England had a central bank, the Bank of England. In fact, it's not just a central bank, it's the central bank. If you're a central banker, it's like going to the Vatican. It's the absolute Xanadu of central banking. It gave the British Empire a stable, standardized money form, an index of all value and exchanges. Americans made 2 similar experiments with central banking before the Civil War. Both failed, and neither managed to enjoy the influence or authority of the Bank of England. Almost precisely as England was abolishing slavery, Americans were yet again abolishing central banking in Andrew Jackson's famous war on the Second United States Bank. In England by 1850, Bank of England notes backed by gold were the nation's standard currency. In the 1850s in the United States, Americans had no central bank, and they instead used more than 9,000 different kinds of paper money. That's not an exaggeration, 9,000 different kinds of paper money, thousands of pieces of what were called token money, and uncounted amounts of weird little fractional things called shin plasters that I'll talk about later. They used other kinds of, that's just illegal money. There are other forms of money that weren't legal that circulated. They used this extraordinary profusion and chaos of competing money forms at the same time as England had a standardized currency.